and it's now embedded in this row crop agriculture matrix. So it was once a sea of grass, then now the grass has become the islands in a sea of crops. We kind of have the opposite situation, and that the fragmentation alone really challenges our native prairie by reducing population sizes and gene flow that's necessary for species to adapt to changing conditions. And so, also the rapid pace of ongoing climate change is just going to exacerbate these challenges for our native prairies. And so, reconstruction is one opportunity, prairie reconstruction is one opportunity to sort of combat this, right? To put some habitat back on the ground. And there's two factors to consider when thinking about climate adaptation in a reconstructive strategy, I think. And those are both where to do the reconstruction and how to do the reconstruction. So, the Nature Conservancy has just completed a nationwide analysis mapping the sites that are most resilient to climate change. So this is that same landscape I was showing you. And these are the sites that have been mapped to sort of potentially resilient to climate change based on diversity of landforms at the site and connectivity of those areas that remains. And so this could be a really useful resource in thinking about strategies for locating reconstructions in areas, to reduce fragmentation, to basically build up larger blocks of land, and also to increase gene flow for those populations, right? And increase that connectivity. Connectivity is one of the most sort of widely cited climate adaptation strategies. So I mentioned this because I think it is an important climate adaptation strategy, but really what we were focused on in this project is more the how. And specifically, we were focused on one of the more tangible parts of the restoration or reconstruction process, which is the seed mix. And one of the places where we have kind of the most room for decision making and to influence those outcomes. And so, I think for a while now, as scientists and practitioners, we've recognized the importance of diversity in our seed mixes. This is not a new concept for many of us. Although I would say that the emphasis has largely been on species diversity. And this is absolutely critical, right? You need species to fill all the different functional niches for a prairie community. You need cool seasons, you need warm seasons, you need legumes, you need forbs, you need grasses. And not only that, right, but you need redundancy in those groups, or many different species in each of those functional groups, so that they can be resilient to changes and disturbances through time. But I think one of the aspects of diversity that's been perhaps given less consideration sometimes is the genetic diversity component. And so, this is likely because it's not as easy to quantify, right, or to measure observationally genetic diversity of a seed mix as it is species diversity, which is something very observable and tangible on the ground. We can't just look at a population of coneflower in a field and know what its genetic diversity is, but we can look at a field and have a good idea of what its species diversity is. And so I think in some ways it's just much harder for us to quantify that and therefore incorporate that into our decision-making process with seed mixes. But regardless, that genetic diversity component is still really important for successful adaptation and therefore, for long-term resilience. The building block of adaptation is really, and natural selection is really variability. And that variability is created in our populations by genetic diversity. So if we want to ensure adaptability, we need to make sure we're thinking about genetic diversity as well as species diversity when we're creating our seed mixes. So I want to talk about, 3 different strategies that have been talked about and discussed in the literature and used potentially in many cases around sort of thinking about genetic diversity and adaptation in seed sourcing. And so I would say, one of the more widely used and recommended strategies currently is that of sourcing seed locally and the idea of local adaptation. And I would say this strategy is not really focused on genetic diversity per se, but it does emphasize the role of local adaptation in the success of prairie plant communities. And it assumes that genetic diversity will be sufficient locally to support that adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. And so, I would say, this paper here is an example of an analysis that's been looking at, the scope of local adaptation in plant species and plant populations. And, local adaptation is a real phenomenon. This meta-analysis is of reciprocal transplants. So where you take species from different places and then you switch them and you plant both local and your sort of non-local populations in the same place, also sometimes called common garden experiments. And this meta-analysis, provides pretty good evidence that local adaptation, is a true phenomenon. However, it's interesting with this paper. It's also a good example, I think, of where you could use the same data from the same paper to come to different conclusions. So, they found that local populations basically outperformed non-local populations in at least one of those paired locations in 71% of their pairs. But if you look at like true reciprocal or local adaptation, where the local population outperforms the non-local populations in both sites, that number drops down to 45%. So, that's still, almost half of species showing local adaptation or local populations outperforming non-local. But you could also say that, there's almost half of those populations where, either local doesn't outperform or one of the populations doesn't outperform and the non-local does better. So basically, I think what we can take from this is that, local adaptation is important to prairie plant communities. And it does show up in how we measure and look at plants quite often, but that there's a lot of variability in species and in the traits you're measuring when you're actually evaluating local adaptation. What you're measuring may influence whether you observe local adaptation or not. And so, one of the other concerns in thinking about local adaptation as a strategy might be that with the isolation of local plant communities for many decades and the rapidly changing conditions, there are also very real concerns about whether or not current local adaptations and those levels of genetic diversity that are existing in those local isolated populations might be enough to sustain populations into the future. So, if we're considering how to source seeds for new reconstructions, we may need to be thinking beyond local in some cases, and maybe focusing more on the adaptation side of that strategy. So one of the other, potential suggested strategies out there in the literature around seed sourcing and climate adaptation is thinking about climate matching. And this is where we think about sourcing seed from locations that are currently experiencing the type of climate that's projected to occur in the future for your reconstruction sites. And so it's this is a paper by Galadowicz et al. Who have kind of looked at that in a way with looking at so the dark here is like the current climate envelope. And this is sort of like where this is the area where the current climate exists, that this is likely to be projected towards in the future. So this area is likely to be experiencing in like the Agassiz Lake Plain climate more similar to across sort of central Nebraska and southeast South Dakota, according to climate envelope models. And so the idea here is with the climate matching strategy is it's building on this concept of local adaptation, right? In that it's assuming that populations at the more southern sites are locally adapted to their current climatic conditions, and that sourcing seed from these populations will confer those advantages to the populations establishing in the new reconstruction. So I think the climate matching strategy really builds on and relies on this concept of local adaptation. And so I think there is some consistency there, but there are also some challenges with this, right? So one of the challenges here is that plants are also likely to be adapted to other types of conditions as well, beyond just, the temperature or precipitation. They may be adapted to the soil type conditions. And so there may be any other number of factors that are important for success and how those plant populations are adapted that may not translate well if you're moving them from some of these other areas. And additionally, if they're adapted to more southern climates that don't quite exist within the range of variability up here in a more northern area yet, they may face challenges in establishing well. So there may be challenges about, current climate versus future climate and getting things to establish well now that may be adapted to the future. And so you end up with challenges along those lines, sure, and as well. And so while I think this strategy may have some challenges, I also think there's, some merit in thinking through these ideas. And I'm not sure, honestly, it's been well tested. So I think we have some room to grow in terms of really understanding whether this would be or could be a viable solution to how we think about seed sourcing in terms of, just simply climate matching our seed sources. And so then the last strategy I want to mention here is one that we were really focused on in this project. And that's the one that's often termed, it's called regional admixture. And so this strategy is really focused on genetic diversity and making sure that we have genetic diversity in the seed mix that's necessary for adaptation. So it also is building on local adaptation in that it suggests, basically using some sort of maybe larger than local, some sort of regional level of seed sources and mixing populations from across that region to increase the genetic diversity, with the assumption that different populations will harbor different types of diversity. And by increasing the number of populations you've mixed together, you increase the amount of genetic diversity and therefore the adaptive potential of the species at your reconstruction site. And so regional admixture, I would say, is really seen as a balance in some ways between, the potential limitations of local adaptation under climate change and fragmentation, and the potential maladaptations of moving seed, greater distances that may be suggested sometimes by strategies like climate matching. So I think this is really a yes and situation. Yes, local adaptation, and we need to make sure we're getting enough genetic diversity into our seed mixes that, we're setting them up for resilience into the future. So honestly, if you read a lot of papers, and there are a lot of papers now out there talking through seed sourcing and local adaptation issues, they've just been increasing through time. A lot of them in the end up recommending these ideas of mixing populations or regional admixture. But I would say this practice is not necessarily the norm yet for how we're thinking about seed sourcing. It's being tried more and more, being used more and more, but it hasn't really been rigorously evaluated. And so that's one of the goals of this project, was really to try actually implementing some of these genetically diverse reconstructions and to set ourselves up to evaluate their success. So we had 4 main project goals with this project. The first is basically to develop resources to help land managers actually implement multiple source seed mixes. It's hard enough to sometimes find species diverse seed mixes, and then you say, all right, well, now you need 3 different sources for every species. That's a pretty daunting task. And so one of the things we were wanting to do was to try to develop some resources to potentially try to make that easier for people to do as they're thinking about building seed mixes and getting seed. And then we wanted to also implement some of these climate adapted restorations and to then evaluate effectiveness, actually set up some experiments or do some of these reconstructions in ways that we can evaluate long-term. And this is granted a commitment to long-term evaluation, as we all know, with evaluating reconstruction success. So, and then finally, we wanted to be able to share not only our learning, but as we were developing these resources, we also realized there was an opportunity to share some of these tools with others and potentially make them useful to others, as we're all trying to basically accomplish, similar things in our reconstructions. So that's what we wanted to share with you today as our progress towards some of these goals. So I say progress because, as I said before, this is a long-term, oh no.
Oh, sorry. It looks like we lost Marissa. Maybe she's having some technical difficulties. So I'll just pick up and continue where she left off. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for your patience. We're talking about how Zoom technology makes our lives more real. We're more human and relatable to each other. So thank you for your patience. Oops. Okay, if someone, or maybe Paul, could you just verify that I'm sharing the right screen?
I see a picture of a butterfly.
Oh, okay. Let's see here. Okay, how about this? You see our field crew?
I do.
Okay, great. She was telling you about what we're learning and, as far as implementing these strategies on the ground. This is our field crew. We've sent out over the last 2 years to go map locations of seed sources across the region. We needed, in order to implement this multiple seed source reconstruction, we needed to know where those seed sources existed across the landscape. As you know, reconstructions need a lot of seed. So last summer, in 2019, we had a crew of at least 15 people and lots of volunteers along the way who were mapping seed locations and collecting seed. And we were so happy to have them on board last season when we could all be out there. And, we had to reduce field staff out mapping and collecting seed again this year.
So Nina, I'm here on my phone.
Okay.
Thank you for taking over and sharing the slides. But yeah, if you want to, I can sort of finish up my part and then I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So we have implemented, as of this fall, 669 acres of climate adapted grassland restoration. And well, actually that was as of this spring, and then we added 100 acres again this fall. So, and each of those reconstructions had at least 3 sources for all of the species that we included. And you can see that these red dots are basically the location of those reconstructions across Western Minnesota, as well as in North Dakota and in South Dakota as well. So working really across our 3-state area. Next slide, Nina. And so we've also been trying to, as I said, set up some of this to do some science alongside our reconstructions and actually evaluate and commit ourselves to evaluating long-term the effect of, multiple sources on establishment success and long-term, diversity and adaptability. So I'm working with Dr. Jill Hamilton at North Dakota State University, and we have 2 graduate students working on various projects, helping us kind of evaluate pieces of this. So this is a picture of Jessica Lindstrom. She has been helping us set up experimental test plots in 2 different locations. So we have experimental plots set up in Minnesota at the Minnesota State University Regional Science Center, just outside Moorhead, Minnesota. And we also have small plots set up in at our South Dakota site on the Missouri Coteau. And so we've set up plots with known mixes of species and population sources. So we've got plots that have just 1 source for all the species in the mix. And then we've got plots that have 5 sources for all of the species in the mix with similar levels of seeding rates. And so we have just established those this year. She is looking at initial establishment success. But as you know, it really takes a few years before you really know what's going on. So we're committed to monitoring these long term, but we have established the small plots and are starting to evaluate that initial establishment success. So more to come there for sure. But Jess is also, as part of her master's degree, taking a lot of the mapping. We, as part of this, did a lot of mapping of locations of where we could get seed for a lot of our in trying to pull in multiple sources, we wanted to know, well, where do you get multiple sources? And so with doing that mapping, we did a ton of mapping, as Nina will talk about in a minute. And so Jess has taken a lot of those points and supplemented them with data points and locations for, I think, 20 different species of prairie grasses and forbs, and locations from herbarium samples, but also the GBIF, the global biodiversity locations, and is doing some species distribution modeling of current distributions under current climatic envelopes, and then going to be modeling
you know, where do those species, what are they predicted to occur based on our different climate scenarios? And then looking at, you know, all right, well, where do they occur under both scenarios? Like where is no regrets or, you know, win-wins for these species going to occur, because it's both in their current distribution, but also in current projected distributions under new climates for these species. So I'm excited to see some of that work, and it's still underway for her. This is a model for, I believe, lead plants under current species, current climate or current conditions. So, Nina, yep, thank you. And so we have another graduate student, Kate Volk, who is working on a growth chamber experiment. So at a much smaller scale for a couple of different species, trying to evaluate, you know, so we say, we make this assumption that different populations have different genetic diversity, but the question is, does that genetic diversity relate at all to different adaptability or traits related to that would help them adapt to climate change? And so that's sort of what Kate is trying to ask with this growth chamber experiment, and looking at, she's taken the map in the middle is all our mapped populations of GM triflorum or prairie smoke. And she's also going to be doing this with Echinacea angustifolia, which is just getting underway now. But then looking at, so pulling from 6 different populations across this area, pulling seeds from known sources and known maternal plants, and being able to replicate across individuals and populations in these areas, and look at under a well-watered situation and a water-limited situation, you know, how they respond. And so do we see different populations respond differently to a drought-like situation? And so to give us an indication, like, is the variability that's inherent on these populations actually going to be indicative, or is there variability in how they're going to respond to some of these climate variables? So that's, if you want to go to the next slide, Nina. She's got some preliminary indication, and so she's measuring a bunch of different traits, and one of those is chlorophyll content. And it does seem like thus far that there is some population variability related to chlorophyll content under different, watering scenarios or water availability scenarios for these plants. And so that does give us some hope that yes, this variability will potentially confer some advantages in terms of adapting to actual climate responses. So with that, I believe, Nina, now I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about our mapping, where we're at with that, and some of the results we have, and talk about some of the tools that we, but really, I mean, Nina has spent so much time developing over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Marissa. Yeah, to introduce myself, I'm Nina Hill. I'm working with Marissa and the science team here at the Nature Conservancy, and been helping out a lot with this project. It's been really fun, really great learning. So we want to share that learning with you. I'm grateful for the chance to share in this webinar today, and we're continuing to learn. So we'll continue to share out, as the reconstructions progress, as those laboratory and field experiments, start producing some results and publications. So I wanted to turn our attention to share a little bit more about one of our demonstration sites. Marissa mentioned we have implemented this multiple seed mix strategy at Reconstructions over the last 2 field seasons. Hopefully we can get out there in the future and see how they're coming along. Today, I can tell you a little bit more in detail about how we were able to put this into practice, how we were able to build climate adaptation into our Reconstruction project. So looking specifically at this town hall reconstruction, you can see it's here indicated by the green circle. This is in west central Minnesota. This was a 72-acre reconstruction. It was formerly a cool season crop that had transitioned to, dominated by smooth brome. So we've seen a lot of that before. After initial site prep, we had burning and spraying, some mowing out there, but we seeded this reconstruction with seed collected from multiple sites. And this map represents the source sites where we harvested seed from across the region. Each of these colored data points corresponds, and there are some overlapping, corresponds to a different species. So in total, you can see here, we collected seed from 13 different sorts sites. And we were able to use this hand harvested seed, add it to our bulk harvest mix, and you're really broadening the diversity of both species and the genetic adaptability from those mixed populations. We're really broadening that library of genetic diversity within that town hall reconstruction so that it can persist through generations, depending on what the environmental conditions bring. But of course, reconstructions require a lot of seed, and it's difficult, maybe difficult to find. But we have tracked this information, not just for town hall, not just from our reconstructions, but all across the region. So you saw our field team who was out there mapping both last year and this year. And in total, this is not actually an updated number, over 30,600 data points exist in this geodatabase across these targeted ecoregions from across the 3 states. So we have mapped source populations and collected them into a geodatabase and built data tools. These resources exist for you, for land managers, to help identify where multiple seed sources are across the landscape. These data and tools are housed in ArcGIS Online, and they're available through the browser, through your web browser, and through a collector mobile app. So yeah, we've got over 30,000 data points and over 176 sites where these populations occur. And that's across various ownerships, the Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife Service, and even Forest Service and state lands. So we've done a lot of the legwork to find populations on the ground, and now it's available for you to use. Let's see. And this database is especially useful for filling in the gaps in the seed mixes, to supplement with species, those early forbs or stuff that is missed from the if we're using a combine harvester, difficult to obtain from vendors or expensive, maybe not even available. The desire here again is to add diversity in terms of species and the genetic diversity. So here's a quick summary of the data that are of those over 30,000 data points. They're divided by plant functional group. You can see that we have 308 total species that are recorded. And just as a kind of summary of what's available in North Dakota and South Dakota, these are the populations that are mapped across those 2 states. So we've got quite a bit, and we're continuing to add information. So yeah, we can use this information to supplement, and as it continues to grow and become more robust, we may be able to identify sites that have multiple species, multiple populations that might be good candidates for using combine harvest. Let's see. So using these data, you can do as we did for town hall. You can use the seed source data to help you supplement diversity. Again, these data are housed through ArcGIS Online. I've provided the link above, and these data and tools are available for anybody who has an enterprise ArcGIS Online account through your organization. So you can access through the web, which we're showing here, and you can search. There's a number of different widgets, they call them, available here to help you query, filter the data, and find what you're really wanting to target to supplement your seed mix. So here's an example of town hall. So just to get oriented to this data exploration web mapping application, here in the center is, of course, the map. It looks very similar to how you would be using it or viewing data through ArcGIS desktop app. And then here you can see the different layers that we have enacted. The seed data points are, again, split out by those plant groups. We have the protected areas database for our region, symbolized by different ownership. And then what's really useful too is to help identify where, oh, sorry about that. There's also protected and remnant prairie data layers in here too. So we can look across the landscape and see, where those really high quality prairies still exist so that we can go and either continue mapping or harvest seed from those. Then this list here provides an aggregate of the data points that are viewed within the map. So that's what's represented here, and we get a list of species. But this corner widget here is to make a report. So this is where it starts getting really useful. You can build a report here. You can either draw a polygon, or what I've done here is actually uploaded a shapefile of our town hall reconstruction. This would be useful to say, I want to target populations within X miles of my reconstruction. And so this helps me do that. I can have this spatial information and then create a buffer around it, or to upload, say, polygons of your fire management from the previous season. So this, you could overlay your fire management and see what populations exist where you burned previous year. So expecting that they would be producing really good seed this upcoming year. So I uploaded that shapefile, and let's just say I want to see what populations are available within 50 miles, and then click results. It creates a really nice visualization for me. And then draw your attention over here to the left is where you can apply different filters. So you can filter the seed data based on location or based on attributes of the population. So for this demonstration, I was interested in targeting early forbs. So I selected that here under plant type and then turned the filter on. I didn't want to include a list of all the locations of big blue, because that's abundant in my particular landscape and I've already got it in my mix. And then I wanted to target those early forb populations that are abundant. So of populations that were mapped of individuals 50 to 100 or above 100 individuals within that population. So large populations on the landscape that I know, I could sustainably harvest and without impacting, the longevity of that population at that source site. So I've applied these various filters. Here's another, and then the final one that I added was, if I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, maybe I only have permission, or, I'd want to start with looking at what's available on Fish and Wildlife Service lands. So, I can filter here by the different ownerships. So once I applied these filters, and you can see within this 50-mile buffer, we have a scattering of these yellow points left. So that's the data points that remain once our filters are applied. Then we go back to the report, click on results, and it'll give us an aggregated list of sites and the species and number of populations that occur, with that fit that data query that I made. And you can even print this report then out into a PDF. It gives you, again, the list of species and list of sites that you can target with for harvest. So I hope that you're thinking, wow, Nina, this is great. How can I use this? How can I get access? And again, this is available to users who have enterprise accounts through ArcGIS Online through their organization. And you can navigate using this link above, or search Prairie Seed Collection Group in ArcGIS Online, or send me an email. And then once you're admitted to the group, you can have access to look at those data. But wait, there's more. You can also use these data, not just in the browser, but you can use them on your mobile device. You can download offline areas and take these data out into the field so that you can navigate to those data points while in the field to harvest populations and continue to build the database with information about your area. So, everybody who contributes to the data will continue to make it grow, be more robust, and really provide a good resource for everybody to use. And just another note that this data is protected through this group. It's not publicly available, but it is available by request. Just so you're not worried about of being out in the wide open, that it is protected in a ArcGIS online group. There was something else. But yeah, we hope that these tools can be useful in a way to you to query, to find those multiple seed sources across the landscape, build the genetic diversity, build that adaptation into your reconstructions. And we can all continue to do good work out there on the landscape. And I guess, and just to close up, wanted to thank our funders. We drew on a lot of different funding sources from Prairie Pothole Joint Venture and able to leverage those funds into nearly $500,000 by the end. So yeah, we'll continue to share learning, and I'd love to open up the rest of this time that we have today for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. And I realized at the beginning, I forgot to say two things. One is that we are recording this session. And the second is that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or you could put, if you just want to like come off mute and ask your question, put an R in the chat. And yeah, we'd be happy to answer any questions that people have, and we'll just take them in the order that they come in the chat.
It kind of feels like the public TV telethon, and operators are standing by to take your call now.
Yeah. Yep, I'm standing by my phone. I do actually have a phone line, but yeah.
So
And
I dropped the link to that ArcGIS online group in the chat.
Amanda has a question. How do people find out whether they can collect on a certain property? You have to contact the ownership of that. And we do have a splash page that comes up at the beginning when you log into the database that says, look, this is information on where populations exist, but this does not give you permission to collect that seed. That must be obtained from the ownership of the site, which should be fairly obvious within the database in terms of if you find something, you should know who owns it. We don't necessarily have all the individual contacts in there for all the individual owner, managers of those sites, because those tend to change over time. But that is something we're thinking about adding, as sort of general contact information. But yeah, so permission does need to be obtained before seed can be collected, for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for bringing that up. I didn't mention that, but yeah, we're working to build some type of contact information into that database, but all the sites are identified with the owners as far as the owning agency or landowner.
Yeah. Let's see, Cassie. No, I don't think we didn't touch on this, but asking whether or not we plan to expand this. And we have talked to, we've talked to World Wildlife Fund, we've talked to a couple other people about expanding this. We are happy to do that. As long as, we're happy to expand. Basically, it would be a matter of making sure we have the right protected layers and things and layers for drop downs. But essentially, we don't currently have plans to hire crews to go out and do mapping in other places, but we're certainly, happy to make this available as a tool to others who want to use this and add information to it. So yeah, if you want to chat more about that, please send Nina and I an email. We'd be happy to talk offline about that.
And James asked a good question. In addition to the location data, what other data are being collected when a species is added to the map? So thanks for that question. Yeah, we collect various information when in the fields. So we map, the data point represents a population. We identify the plant type and the species and abundance, distribution, phenology at the time of visit, whether we collected seed during that visit or not, and then a little bit more about the context of which that population exists in, as far as slope and aspect. I think that's it. Was there anything else that you can think of? Slope and aspect, of the landscape context.
Yeah, I think that covers it. And the abundance and distribution are categorized. So into, sort of general categories for those things. And it's not a rigorous protocol for like density or abundance or percent cover.
Yeah, and to carry off of Cassie's question too, as far as expanding into different areas, we have had a couple of projects within Minnesota, within the Nature Conservancy, who had been tracking this information already, but it was available. They tracked it on their own machine in an Excel spreadsheet, but they had the spatial data available. So if you have similar data available with populations and location information, we can talk more about incorporating that data into this geodatabase. So yeah, you can send me a message and I'd be happy to talk to you about, supplementing with data from your area.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as simple as like a hit and upload button, but doesn't seem to be too bad. Let's see, question about, when and where can I find the recording? I will let Paul or Amanda answer that question.
I just posted it on the website, or on the chat box rather.
Oh yeah, there you are. Okay, sorry, I think I missed that at the bottom there. Yeah, and hopefully as soon as it's done. I mean, sometimes it takes a while to finish processing after the webinar, but it shouldn't take too long to make that available. Pauline, we could find if we compared genetic characteristics of species in older plantings with characteristics of the same species and source remnants. Yes. So I think that's a great question. And honestly, so when we did this, we have seed from all our populations and from our remnant populations, and we want to be able to actually do the genetic test at some point. And fortunately, that stuff and that material keeps, but we've yet to be able to find the funding to actually fund the genetics piece. And I think there's so many questions that we could help elucidate in terms of connectivity, in terms of understanding the actual diversity we're working with in our remnants, and how much we need to be concerned about mixing in some areas and how it's related to size. I mean, I think it would help us elucidate a lot of questions if we could answer some of these, if we could find the money to fund some of the genetics work. And we've set this up to be able to like go back and ask those questions from this by collecting the material, because Jill Hamilton, my collaborator, evolutionary genomics is one of her specialties, and so she has a strong interest in that too. So we're still trying to figure out where to get funding to do these things, to fund that aspect of the work. And that is one of the things we hope long term to be tracking with our small plots too, is to be able to say, all right, how is it going to change over time? And do we actually see, if you have 5 sources, that you see that incorporation of the diversity from the 5 sources, or does one become dominant? And how does that play out over time? So I think these are important questions to understand in terms of climate adaptation. And I also think there's another, like the Resilient and Connected Lands Network that I mentioned in the beginning, talking about, where to potentially do reconstructions. I think there's a lot of room for using genetics to actually test the validity and connectivity of some of those resilience layers too. And I don't mean, I guess, to say validity, but like the relevance to particular species, because species data was not used to create those maps. So I think there's a lot of room there for some landscape genetics and helping us actually understand how to best use these tools and how to best do these reconstructions. So yeah, thanks for that, Pauline. I think I feel passionate about that too, as you can probably see. Yeah, even morphological work could yield intriguing results for sure. Yep, and pairing the two would be ideal, especially looking at like traits that confer adaptive ability and actually looking at, the genetic linkages of some of those traits too. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? I come at this from a science perspective because that's my background, but in wanting to make the science useful to practitioners. And so that's that's where we're hoping these, the tool will help some in recognizing that it is daunting trying to create these seed mixes and thinking about all these aspects of diversity. Yeah, agreed, Jamie. It'd be interesting to know which source populations persist in any particular reconstruction. We have not, Pauline asked the question about prairies show hesitancy being put on a map this way. There are no private landowners included in these maps. It's all public or conservation lands. So, and they're not public in a way because we're just sharing, and at this point with just a few users. But if it becomes bigger, that will be something we will want to sort of figure out and address. We do have some populations in South Dakota mapped on the state school trust lands, which are state-owned lands, but sort of privately leased. But we only worked with land, lessees who are willing to, cooperate with us in terms of mapping and interested in working with us. So. Any other questions or comments?
Oh, Mike asked a question about, pointing out that soil types differ greatly from different parts of the state, and how are we determining success with soil types as one metric?
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. I know that so Kate Volk, her work with the greenhouse is actually, so she specifically chose her populations balancing different soil types to actually take that into consideration and looking at how variability, not only just within between populations, but between populations, and seeing whether soil type plays a role in how they respond, particularly to something like water availability, which is greatly controlled by soil type and texture. So far, her preliminary results have found very little evidence that soil type plays a role. She's finding variability, but it's not being explained by soil type in her analyses. We haven't, so in our other small plot experiments, they're within a fairly homogeneous similar area on similar soil types, so it doesn't specifically play a role as strongly in those experiments. I don't know if that answers your question. Well, if there are no other questions or comments, we could just wrap it up. I don't know, Paul or Amanda.
Yeah, I don't see anything either. We sure appreciate your time today. Appreciate you sharing all that work. That was that's a pretty big project, and we, yeah, I'm impressed with all the time and the thoroughness, and be curious to know if there'll be some follow-up later on, the insights you've gained, and if you be a chance for you to come back and kind of share those with us as you move forward.
Yes, hopefully that's the plan. It's just the beginning. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's just the beginning, right? Now there's the dedication to the monitoring and the tracking and evaluation over time. So I hope to have more things to share in the future for sure.
We'll save a space for you.
Sounds good.
Well, thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining us. And again, we will be posting this on the PRI website, and it'll be on the webinars page. So thanks, Amanda, for reminding me of that.
Thank you all. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks.